Hello everyone, and welcome back to Veiled Terrors. Tonight we are venturing deep into the shadowy spine of America, the Appalachian Trail, a place as haunted by legend as it is by real events. In today's episode, I am bringing you the 8 most disturbing true horror stories ever to emerge from these ancient mountains. All shared by those who walk these trails and survive to tell the tale. From chilling encounters near abandoned shelters and the mysterious voices echoing from old mine shafts to hikers vanishing without a trace, each narrative has been meticulously pieced together from first-hand reports, local accounts, and trail records. Every detail you will hear has been weighed for authenticity with names, and certain circumstances changed to preserve the privacy of those involved. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Veiled Terrors for daily explorations into the darkest true horror stories imaginable. And do not forget to hit that notification bell so you are always the first to know when something terrifying unfolds. If you or someone you know has experienced something unexplainable on the Appalachian Trail or elsewhere, share your story in the comments below. You may hear it featured in a future episode. Back in late September 2019, a man named Alex decided to tackle a solo section hike through Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. He had been hiking for about 15 years at that point, with plenty of solo experience under his belt. When his regular hiking partner bailed on their planned trip due to work commitments, he figured this would be the perfect opportunity to clear his head and enjoy some solitude on the trail. A co-worker had asked him something like, "Are you sure about going alone? I heard there have been some weird incidents in that area lately." Alex brushed off the concerns, telling his colleague he had done dozens of solo hikes before and knew how to handle himself in the wilderness. He supposed, in retrospect, that his coworker was right to be worried. What he encountered over those 4 days challenged everything he thought he knew about being alone in the mountains. He started his hike early on a Thursday morning at Skyline Drive, planning to cover about 12 miles per day through some of the more remote sections of the park. The weather was perfect: crisp autumn air, brilliant foliage, and crystal clear skies. For the first day and a half, everything went exactly as planned. He made good time, enjoyed some spectacular views, and felt that familiar sense of peace that comes from being completely disconnected from civilization. He had planned to stay at designated campsites, but on the second night, he decided to set up camp at a more secluded spot about half a mile off the main trail near a small clearing he had discovered during a previous hike years earlier. That second night, as he was settling into his sleeping bag around 1030, he heard something that made him pause. It was the sound of footsteps, deliberate, measured footsteps circling his campsite at a distance of maybe 50 yards. At first, he thought it might be a deer or a black bear investigating his camp, which would not have been unusual, but these footsteps had a rhythm to them that seemed distinctly human. They would walk for about 30 seconds, pause for 10, then continue. The pattern repeated for nearly 20 minutes before finally stopping. He grabbed his headlamp and stepped outside his tent to investigate, sweeping the beam across the tree line. He called out a friendly hello, thinking it might be another hiker who was lost or looking for a place to camp. But there was no response, just dead silence. After waiting for several more minutes and hearing nothing, he convinced himself it had been an animal after all and went back to sleep. The next morning, he discovered the first gift. About 10 feet from his tent, arranged in a perfect circle, were 7 small animal bones. They looked like they came from squirrels or chipmunks, all cleaned completely of flesh and bleached white as if they had been sitting in the sun for months. But what disturbed him most was how precisely they were arranged, each bone pointing inward toward the center of the circle, with small rocks placed between them in a pattern he could not decipher. The whole arrangement was maybe 2 feet in diameter and had definitely not been there when he set up camp the previous evening. His first instinct was to think some other hiker was playing an elaborate prank, but the bones looked far too old and weathered to have been collected recently. Plus, the level of precision in the arrangement suggested someone had spent considerable time and effort creating it. He took several photos with his phone, then kicked the bones apart and continued on his way, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in his stomach. That third night, he made sure to camp at an official campsite, thinking the presence of other hikers would discourage whatever prankster might be following him. But the Cosby Knob shelter was completely empty when he arrived. This was not unusual for late September on a weekday, but it meant he was still alone. He set up his tent near the shelter and built a small campfire, hoping the light and smoke might attract any other hikers in the area. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time they were closer, maybe 25 yards from his tent, and this time he could tell with absolute certainty that they belonged to a person. The stride length, the way the weight shifted from heel to toe, the occasional pause to navigate around obstacles, these were human footsteps, no question. But whoever was out there was trying to be quiet, placing each step carefully and deliberately. He lay in his sleeping bag, heart pounding, listening to the slow circuit around his campsite. The footsteps would stop for long periods, sometimes 5 or 10 minutes at a time before resuming. During one of these pauses, he heard something that made his blood run cold, a low, humming sound like someone singing a wordless tune under their breath. It was just loud enough for him to hear, but too quiet to make out any melody. After what felt like hours, the sounds finally stopped. He stayed awake until dawn, clutching his knife and listening for any sign of movement. When the sun came up, he quickly packed his gear and hiked to the shelter to use the privy before heading out. That was when he found the second gift. Hanging from the shelter's eaves, suspended by what looked like fishing line, was a small bundle wrapped in strips of bark. Inside the bundle were more bones, these from a larger animal, possibly a raccoon, along with several molted bird feathers and what appeared to be dried berries arranged in another precise pattern. There was also a small piece of paper with symbols drawn in what looked like charcoal. The symbols meant nothing to him, but they had been drawn with the same careful precision as the bone arrangements. He should have hiked out right then. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to get off the trail and report what he had found to park rangers. But he had planned a 4-day hike, and some stubborn part of him was not ready to let some weirdo chase him out of the mountains. He told himself he would be more careful, stay alert, and if anything else happened, he would head straight for the nearest road. That decision nearly cost him his life. The fourth and final night, he chose a campsite near Hawksbill Summit, thinking the elevation and open terrain would make it harder for someone to approach without being seen. He pitched his tent in a small grove of trees about 50 yards below the summit with clear sight lines in all directions. He built another fire and kept it burning until well after dark, feeding it enough wood to last most of the night. This time he did not have to wait until midnight. The footsteps began around 9:30, but they were different now. Faster, more confident, as if whoever was out there had grown tired of the slow, stalking approach. He could hear them moving through the trees, not trying to be quiet anymore, just circling his camp at a steady pace. He unzipped his tent and crawled out with his headlamp in one hand and his knife in the other. He swept the beam across the tree line and called out, "I know you're out there. What do you want?" The footsteps stopped immediately, but he could feel eyes watching him from the darkness beyond his light. For several minutes they stayed in this standoff. Him standing beside his tent, slowly turning in place and scanning the trees while something lurked just outside the reach of his headlamp beam. Then he heard the humming again, louder this time and coming from multiple directions. It took him a moment to realize that the sound was moving, circling his camp at the same steady pace as the footsteps had been, but now there were no footsteps at all. Just that low, wordless humming drifting through the darkness like a ghostly chorus. That was when he saw the first figure. About 30 yards away, at the very edge of his headlamp beam, something tall and thin stepped out from behind a tree. It was definitely human in shape, but wrong somehow, too tall, too angular, moving with a strange, jerky motion like a marionette controlled by an amateur puppeteer. The figure stood there for several seconds, completely motionless while the humming continued from other directions. He called out again, louder this time, "Who are you? What do you want?" Instead of answering, the figure began to walk toward him. Its movement was hypnotic and terrifying. Each step precisely placed, arms swinging in perfect rhythm, head held unnaturally straight. As it got closer, he could make out more details. The person was wearing what looked like hiking clothes, but they hung loose and strange, as if they were several sizes too large. The face was hidden in shadow beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but he could see pale hands dangling from sleeves that extended well past the wrists. When the figure reached the edge of his firelight, about 15 feet from where he stood, it stopped and slowly raised one arm to point at him. That was when he saw the third gift. Clutched in the figure's pointing hand was another small bundle, this one larger than the previous ones, and tied with what looked like strips of cloth. Even from 15 feet away, he could see dark stains on the cloth and smell something rank and putrid coming from the bundle. The figure held it out toward him like an offering while the humming from the darkness grew louder and more insistent. He backed toward his tent, never taking his eyes off the figure, and grabbed his backpack. "Stay away from me," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm leaving, just leave me alone." The figure did not move, but the humming suddenly stopped. In the silence that followed, he could hear his own rapid breathing and the crackling of the fire. Then, from somewhere in the darkness behind the figure came a voice, low, raspy, and barely human. "You cannot leave," it said. "Not yet. We have been waiting for you." That was when he ran. He left everything behind except his backpack and headlamp, crashing through the trees in the direction he thought would take me toward the main trail. Behind him, he could hear multiple voices calling out, some laughing, some making that same humming sound, some speaking in words he could not understand. He ran for what felt like miles, stumbling over rocks and through underbrush, following deer paths and game trails, completely lost but too terrified to stop. He finally reached a paved road around dawn, exhausted and bleeding from dozens of cuts and scrapes. A park ranger found him there an hour later, sitting on the guardrail in a state of shock. He told the ranger everything about the bone arrangements, the circling footsteps, the humming in the darkness, and the figure with the bundle. The ranger listened patiently, then drove him to the ranger station, where he repeated his story to 2 other officials. They took his reports seriously and organized a search of the area where he had been camping. They found his abandoned tent and gear, along with the remains of his campfire. But they also found other things, more bone arrangements, some much older and more elaborate than the ones he had seen. Hidden in a small cave about a quarter-mile from his campsite, they discovered what appeared to be a long-term camp with supplies, tools, and dozens of the cloth-wrapped bundles he had seen the figure carrying. The rangers told him they had received similar reports over the past 2 years. Hikers describing being followed, finding strange arrangements of bones and other objects, hearing voices in the darkness. Several people had reported encounters with unusually tall, thin figures who moved in disturbing ways, but Alex was the first person to provide such detailed descriptions and stick around long enough for a thorough investigation. 3 weeks later, the rangers arrested a man named Carl Morrison, who had been living illegally in the park for over 2 years. They found him in a makeshift shelter deep in the backcountry, surrounded by the materials he had been using to create his gifts for passing hikers. Morrison had a history of mental illness and had apparently become obsessed with what he called collecting specimens from people who ventured into what he considered his territory. But here is the thing that still keeps Alex awake some nights. Morrison was only 5'6" tall and weighed maybe 140 pounds. The figure he saw that night was well over 6 feet tall and moved in ways that no normal person could move. When he mentioned this to the rangers, they suggested that fear and darkness could distort perceptions, that Morrison might have been wearing some kind of costume or platform shoes to appear taller and more threatening. Maybe they were right. Maybe what he saw was just an unbalanced man playing an elaborate and terrifying game. But he knows what he saw, and he knows what he heard that night. And sometimes, when he's alone in the wilderness, he still finds himself listening for the sound of measured footsteps circling just outside the reach of his campfire light. A man named Daniel was dealing with what you might call a midlife crisis back in April 2020. At 47 years old, recently divorced, and feeling completely lost in life, he decided to take 3 weeks off work and attempt a solo section hike through the Great Smoky Mountains. He had done plenty of hiking before, but never anything this ambitious or remote. When his brother asked something like, "Are you sure you are ready for something this challenging right now?" he told him that he needed the time alone to figure things out, that the wilderness had always been where he found clarity. He guessed his brother was right to question his timing. What he discovered on that trail taught him that sometimes getting lost in the mountains is nothing compared to being lost in life. He started his hike at the Cataract Falls trailhead, planning to follow the Appalachian Trail north through some of the most remote sections of the Smokies. The first 4 days went exactly as he had hoped. The weather was perfect, the trail was well marked, and the solitude was exactly what his troubled mind needed. He was averaging about 14 miles per day, camping at designated sites and slowly feeling some of that crushing weight of his failed marriage and career disappointments beginning to lift. On the 5th day, everything changed. He was about 3 miles north of Clingman's Dome when he came to a trail junction that was not marked on any of his maps. According to his GPS and the official trail guides, the Appalachian Trail should have continued straight ahead for another 2 miles before the next legitimate junction. But there, clear as day, was a well-worn path leading off to the east with what appeared to be official white blazes painted on the trees. Now, he knew that trail blazes could sometimes be difficult to spot or might fade over time, so finding an unmarked junction was not necessarily cause for alarm. But these blazes looked fresh, bright white paint that stood out clearly against the bark. They were also positioned at exactly the right height and spacing as the legitimate trail markers he had been following for days. He stood at the junction for several minutes, consulting his maps and GPS. Everything indicated that he should continue straight, but those white blazes leading east were undeniably official-looking. He reasoned that perhaps his maps were outdated, or that the Park Service had rerouted this section of trail for maintenance or environmental reasons. Trail reroutes were not uncommon, and it would explain why his maps did not show this particular path. After 20 minutes of deliberation, he decided to follow the blazes. The path seemed well maintained, and he could see more white markers disappearing into the forest ahead. If it was a legitimate reroute, it would eventually reconnect with the main trail. If not, he could always backtrack to the junction and continue on the mapped route. For the first hour, the path seemed perfectly normal. It was perhaps slightly narrower than the main Appalachian Trail, but it was clearly established and showed signs of regular use. The blazes appeared every 100 yards or so, exactly as they should. He made good time, covering about 3 miles before stopping for lunch near what appeared to be an old camping area. That was when he found the first disturbing sign. Hidden partially under a pile of leaves near the cold remains of a fire ring, he discovered a torn piece of bright blue fabric. It looked like it had come from a hiking jacket or rain gear, and it had clearly been there for some time. The fabric was faded and weathered, but he could still make out what appeared to be dried bloodstains along one edge. He picked up the fabric and examined it more closely. The tear looked deliberate rather than accidental, as if someone had cut it away with a knife rather than snagging it on a branch. There were also several small holes in the material that looked like they might have come from something sharp being pushed through it repeatedly. His first thought was that someone had been injured here and used the fabric as a makeshift bandage. But something about the scene felt wrong. The camping area had been used recently enough that there should have been other signs of human presence: food wrappers, footprints, disturbed ground around the fire ring. Instead, everything except the fabric had been meticulously cleaned up, as if someone had deliberately removed all other evidence of their presence. He stuffed the fabric into his pack and continued following the blazes, but now he was paying much closer attention to his surroundings. Over the next 2 hours, the path began to feel increasingly wrong. It was leading him steadily away from where his GPS indicated the main trail should be, and the terrain was becoming more rugged and difficult to navigate. Around 4 in the afternoon, he came across the second find. Wedged between 2 rocks just off the trail was a small digital camera, the kind that serious hikers often carry to document their journeys. The camera was in remarkably good condition, considering it had obviously been outside for months, protected from the weather by the rock formation. When he turned it on, the battery was dead, but he could see from the exterior that it was a high-end model that would have been expensive to replace. Why would someone abandon an expensive camera in the middle of the wilderness? And why hide it between rocks rather than leaving it where it might be found by other hikers? The whole situation was beginning to feel seriously wrong. But he was now nearly 6 miles from the junction where he had left the main trail, and daylight was starting to fade. He decided to push on for another hour, hoping to find either a suitable camping spot or some sign that the trail was leading back toward civilization. But as the sun began to set, the blazes led him into increasingly rough terrain. He was now scrambling over loose rock and pushing through dense undergrowth, following markers that seemed to appear just often enough to keep him moving forward. That was when he realized the blazes were wrong. He'd been hiking the Appalachian Trail for over a decade, and he knew that official trail markers were painted using a specific type of paint and brush technique that created a consistent appearance. But when he examined the blazes more closely with his headlamp, he could see that these had been painted with a different type of paint, slightly different in color and texture from the legitimate markers he had been following for days. Someone had been painting false blazes. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Someone had deliberately created a fake trail, complete with convincing markers, designed to lure hikers away from the safety of the main trail. But why? And what had happened to the owners of the fabric and camera he had found? He immediately pulled out his GPS to get a bearing back to the legitimate trail, but he discovered that he was now nearly 12 miles from the main Appalachian Trail, deep in unmarked wilderness with no established paths leading back. Worse, the terrain between his current position and the main trail was extremely rough, steep ravines, dense forest, and rocky outcrops that would be treacherous to navigate in daylight, let alone in darkness. He had no choice but to make camp where he was and try to find his way back in the morning. He found a relatively flat spot among some large boulders and set up his tent, but he did not build a fire. Something about the situation felt dangerous, and he did not want to advertise his presence to whoever might have created this false trail. As he lay in his sleeping bag that night, he could not shake the feeling that he was not alone in those mountains. Every sound, every snapping twig or rustling leaf, seemed potentially threatening. Around midnight, he heard what sounded like voices in the distance, too far away and distorted by the terrain to make out any words, but definitely human conversation. He stayed awake until dawn, listening and trying to determine the direction of the voices. They seemed to come from somewhere ahead of him, in the direction the false blazes had been leading. Whatever was out there, he was sure he did not want to encounter it. The next morning, he used his GPS to plot a course back toward the main trail, ignoring the false blazes entirely. It took him nearly 8 hours of brutal hiking through unmarked wilderness to cover the distance he had traveled in 6 hours on the false trail. He had to rappel down 2 steep ravines and push through miles of dense undergrowth, tearing his clothes and gear on thorns and branches. When he finally reached the Appalachian Trail, he was exhausted, dehydrated, and bleeding from dozens of cuts. But he was alive, and he was back on a legitimate path that would lead him to safety. He hiked straight to the nearest ranger station and reported everything he had found: the false blazes, the torn fabric, the abandoned camera, and the voices he had heard in the night. The rangers took his report very seriously and organized an immediate search of the area. What they found was worse than he had imagined. Following the false blazes to their endpoint, they discovered a crude campsite hidden in a deep ravine about 2 miles from where he had turned back. The site contained the personal belongings of at least 6 different hikers, backpacks, sleeping bags, identification documents, and personal items that had clearly been taken from people over a period of several months. They also found Harold Wickham. Harold was a 63-year-old retired teacher from Ohio who had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier while attempting a solo section hike through the Smokies. The rangers found him in a makeshift shelter, malnourished and suffering from exposure, but alive. He told them that he had followed the false blazes just as Daniel had, but when he tried to turn back, he had become completely lost and injured his ankle in a fall. According to Harold, he had been surviving on minimal food and water while trying to signal for help, but the ravine was too deep and remote for his emergency whistle or mirror to be effective. He had seen signs that someone else was in the area, footprints around his shelter, food that had been moved or taken, but he never saw who it was. The rangers never found the person responsible for creating the false trail, but they did discover that similar incidents had been reported in other remote areas of the park over the past year. Someone was systematically creating fake trails designed to lure hikers into dangerous situations, though their ultimate motivation remained unclear. Harold recovered fully, and the camera Daniel found contained photos from 3 different hikers who had apparently fallen victim to the same scheme. The rangers were able to identify 2 of them from the photos and confirmed that both had been reported missing in the past 6 months. He completed his planned hike after a few days of rest, but he never again trusted a trail marker without confirming it against multiple maps and GPS readings. And sometimes, when he's hiking alone in remote areas, he still finds himself wondering what would have happened if he had continued following those false blazes into that ravine, and whether he would have been strong enough to survive whatever was waiting there in the darkness. Back in October 2018, a father decided to take his wife and their 12-year-old son on what was supposed to be a memorable family hiking trip along a section of the Appalachian Trail near Dalton, Massachusetts. They had been talking about doing more outdoor activities together, and after months of planning, they finally carved out a long weekend for this adventure. A co-worker had mentioned something like, "You sure you want to take the kid on such a remote section? I heard there have been some strange incidents up there lately." The father brushed off his concerns, telling him they were experienced day hikers and that his son was old enough to handle a few nights in the wilderness. He supposed, looking back, that his coworker was right to be worried. What they encountered at that trail shelter changed how they think about the supposed safety of designated camping areas. They started their hike on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October, planning to spend 3 nights on the trail before hiking back to their car. The fall foliage was spectacular, and the boy was excited to be camping in what he called the real wilderness for the first time. They made good time on their first day, covering about 8 miles before reaching the K-Wood shelter just as the sun was beginning to set. Trail shelters are supposed to be safe havens for hikers, 3 walled structures with a roof, built and maintained by hiking clubs and park services specifically to provide overnight accommodation along long-distance trails. Most follow a first-come, first-served policy, and it is common to share shelter space with other hikers. They had used shelters many times before on shorter trips, and they had always been positive experiences. But something felt wrong about K-Wood Shelter from the moment they arrived. The shelter itself appeared normal, a standard 3-walled log structure with a wooden floor and metal roof, positioned in a small clearing about 50 yards off the main trail. But the area around it looked like someone had been living there for an extended period. There were personal belongings scattered around that clearly did not belong to passing hikers: cooking pots, tools, rope, tarps, and what appeared to be semi-permanent modifications to the shelter structure. Most concerning was a large tarp stretched between trees behind the shelter, creating an additional enclosed space that was completely hidden from the trail. Under this tarp, they could see more belongings: sleeping bags, food containers, and what looked like surveillance equipment, including binoculars and a spotting scope. The boy immediately asked, "Dad, is someone living here?" Before the father could answer, a voice came from behind the tarp. "Yeah, someone is living here, and you folks need to move along and find somewhere else to camp." A man emerged from the hidden area, and the father immediately felt a chill of unease. He was probably in his 50s, tall and gaunt, with long, greasy hair and clothes that looked like they had not been washed in months. But what bothered the father most were his eyes. They had an intensity that made his skin crawl, and he was staring at his wife and son in a way that made every parental instinct he'd start screaming warnings. "I'm sorry," the father said, trying to keep his voice calm and friendly. "We didn't realize anyone was staying here. This is a public shelter, right? We were planning to camp here tonight." The man stepped closer, and the father could see that he was carrying a large hunting knife on his belt. "Public shelter," he said with a harsh laugh. "I have been maintaining this place for 2 years. I built that back area. I keep the water source clear. I repair damage from storms. This is my home now, and I don't appreciate strangers showing up and thinking they can just move in." The mother stepped closer to their son, her maternal instincts clearly as activated as his protective ones. "We understand you have been taking care of this place," she said diplomatically. "But we have hiked 8 miles today and our son is tired. Could we possibly share the space for just 1 night? We would be happy to contribute to the maintenance costs." The man's expression darkened. "Your son, huh?" He looked the boy up and down in a way that made the father's blood run cold. "How old is he?" 12, 13. Nice, strong kid. Bet he could be useful around here." That was when the father knew they needed to leave immediately. But it was getting dark, they were miles from the nearest road, and their son was already exhausted from the day's hiking. Plus, this man clearly knew the area much better than they did, and something about his demeanor suggested that simply walking away might not be enough to ensure their safety. "Listen," the father said, trying to project a confidence he did not feel. "We don't want any trouble. Maybe you could recommend another camping spot nearby. We're happy to move along." The man smiled, and it was one of the most unsettling expressions the father had ever seen. "Oh, you'll be moving along eventually," he said. "But first, why don't you folks sit down and we can have a proper conversation? I don't get many visitors, especially not families with young boys." He gestured toward the shelter with his knife hand, making it clear that this was not really a request. The husband and wife exchanged glances, and he could see the fear in her eyes. Their son was picking up on the tension and had moved to stand directly between them, looking confused and frightened. "Actually," the father said, "I think we will set up our tent somewhere else tonight. Come on, family, let's get going." But as they turned to leave, the man moved to block their path back to the trail. "I don't think you understand," he said, his voice taking on a threatening tone. "I have been alone up here for a long time, and I have gotten very particular about my privacy. People who stumble across my home tend to go back to town and start talking to rangers, asking questions, causing problems for me. I can't have that." That was when the father noticed the shelter's logbook lying open near the entrance. Trail shelters typically have logbooks where hikers can sign in, record their experiences, and communicate with other hikers. But the entries in this logbook were disturbing. Instead of the usual brief comments about weather and trail conditions, there were detailed descriptions of families and solo hikers who had visited the shelter, including physical descriptions, gear inventories, and what appeared to be behavioral observations. One entry dated just 2 weeks earlier caught his eye: family of 4 from Connecticut, 2 teenage daughters, father overprotective, mother nervous type. Daughters would be useful for camp maintenance. Should return to this area soon. Another entry from a month before that: solo female hiker, mid-20s, good physical condition, carrying expensive gear, claimed to be hiking Virginia section. "Would make good long-term companion," the tracker wrote. He realized with growing horror that this man had been using the shelter to catalog and potentially prey upon passing hikers, and now he was looking at his family the same way. "Son," he said quietly, "I need you to walk back toward the trail and wait for us there. Don't go far, just give us adults a few minutes to talk." But the man immediately objected. "No, no, the boy stays here. We're all going to have a nice conversation together. I have been planning what I would do when the right family came along, and you folks are perfect." He reached for the boy's arm, and that was when the father's protective instincts completely took over. He stepped between them and grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it away from his son. "Don't touch him," he said, no longer trying to hide the threat in his voice. The man tried to pull his knife, but the father was ready for it. He had done some martial arts training in college, and while he was rusty, adrenaline was giving him strength and speed he had not felt in years. He managed to pin his knife hand while his wife grabbed their son and started moving toward the trail. "Run," he yelled to them. "Get back to the main trail and keep going." He held the man for as long as he could, but he was stronger than he looked and clearly had experience fighting. When he managed to break free, the father did not try to continue the struggle. He just ran after his family as fast as he could. They ran for nearly 2 miles in the dark, using their headlamps to follow the white blazes back the way they had come. Behind them, they could hear the man crashing through the woods, and at one point the father saw a flashlight beam sweeping back and forth among the trees as he tried to track them. They did not stop until they reached the parking area where they had left their car that morning. By then it was after midnight, and they were all exhausted and shaken. But they were alive, and they were together, and that was all that mattered. The next morning, the father called the local ranger station and reported everything they had experienced. The rangers took their report very seriously and immediately organized a search of the Kaywood shelter area. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The man, who turned out to be named Marcus Fletcher, had been living illegally in the shelter area for over 2 years. He had created an elaborate campsite with multiple hiding spots and surveillance positions that allowed him to observe hikers without being detected. In his possessions, they found detailed files on dozens of hikers, including photographs taken without permission, copies of identification documents he had somehow obtained, and what appeared to be plans for abducting specific individuals. Most disturbing were the entries in several notebooks describing what he called his collection project. Fletcher had apparently been planning to gradually abduct hikers, especially families with children, and force them to help him build what he described as a sustainable wilderness community where he would be the leader. The rangers also found evidence that Fletcher had been interfering with other hikers in ways that went far beyond their encounter. He had been moving or destroying trail markers to confuse people, contaminating water sources to force hikers to rely on him for assistance, and in at least 2 cases, had apparently followed female hikers for miles before they managed to reach populated areas. Fletcher was arrested and eventually pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including stalking, assault, and illegal occupation of public lands. During his sentencing hearing, they learned that he had a long history of antisocial behavior and had been living off-grid in various locations for nearly a decade. But here is what still bothers the father about the whole experience. Fletcher was just one man operating in one small section of a trail that spans over 2,000 miles. How many other Marcus Fletchers are out there, using the isolation and vulnerability of wilderness areas to prey upon innocent people? They still go hiking as a family, but they never stay in trail shelters anymore. And the father always carries more than just a knife when they are camping in remote areas, because he learned that night that sometimes the most dangerous predators in the wilderness walk on 2 legs and know exactly how to exploit the trust and goodwill of the hiking community. Their son is 20 now, and he still talks about that night sometimes. He says it taught him that being afraid is not cowardly, it's smart. And that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who look just like regular people until they show you who they really are. A woman named Chloe decided to attempt her first solo section hike along the Appalachian Trail through West Virginia, specifically the stretch near Harper's Ferry, back in May 2021. At 34 years old, she had been hiking with groups and friends for over a decade, but she had never attempted a multi-day solo trip. When her hiking buddy canceled at the last minute due to a family emergency, she almost canceled the trip entirely. A friend from her hiking club had said something like, "Are you sure about going alone, especially that section? It gets pretty remote, and there have been some concerning reports lately." Chloe told her she was well prepared, had all the right gear, and that thousands of people hike that section safely every year. She supposed her friend was right to be concerned. What she experienced over those 5 days taught her that sometimes the most dangerous predators in the wilderness are not the 4-legged kind. She started her hike early on a Wednesday morning in mid-May, planning to cover about 12 miles per day through some of the most historic and scenic sections of the trail. The weather was perfect, clear skies, comfortable temperatures, and the spring wildflowers were in full bloom. Her plan was to hike northbound from Harper's Ferry to Front Royal, Virginia, staying at designated campsites and shelters along the way. The first day went exactly as planned. She made good time, enjoyed the solitude, and felt confident in her decision to tackle this challenge alone. She spent her first night at the Ed Garvey shelter, where she met a friendly couple from Pennsylvania who were section hiking southbound. They shared trail information and had a pleasant evening around a small campfire before turning in for the night. The second day started normally as well, but around noon, she encountered another solo hiker heading in the same direction as her. He introduced himself as Marcus and claimed to be attempting a flip-flop through hike, meaning he was planning to hike the entire trail, but in sections rather than all at once. Marcus appeared to be in his early 40s, reasonably fit, and seemed knowledgeable about the trail. They walked together for about an hour, making pleasant conversation about hiking experiences and trail conditions. But something about Marcus felt off from the beginning. He asked too many personal questions: where she was from, what she did for work, whether she was married, where she was planning to stay each night. When she kept her answers vague, as most experienced hikers do when talking to strangers, he became more persistent. He also had an unsettling habit of staring at her when he thought she was not looking, and his questions about her camping plans felt more like an interrogation than casual trail conversation. After about an hour of hiking together, Chloe told Marcus that she preferred to hike at her own pace and suggested they part ways. He seemed disappointed but agreed, saying he was going to take a longer break at the next water source anyway. She picked up her pace and put some distance between them, relieved to be alone again. But that relief was short-lived. About 3 hours later, as she was setting up her tent at her planned campsite near Crampton Gap, she heard footsteps approaching through the woods. It was Marcus, claiming that he had made better time than expected and had decided to camp at the same spot. This struck her as odd because there were several other suitable camping areas along that section of trail, and it seemed like quite a coincidence that they would end up at the same location. She was polite but kept her distance, setting up her camp about 50 yards away from where Marcus was establishing his site. As evening approached, he kept trying to start conversations and suggested they share a campfire. She declined, saying she was tired and planning to turn in early. But throughout the night, she could see the beam of his headlamp moving around the campsite area, and several times she heard footsteps near her tent. The third day, she got up early and packed quickly, hoping to get a head start and avoid another day of unwanted company. But when she reached the next shelter around lunchtime, Marcus was already there, sitting calmly as if he had been waiting for her to arrive. "How did you get here so fast?" she asked, genuinely confused. According to her maps and GPS, he should not have been able to reach this location ahead of her unless he had started hiking much earlier or was moving significantly faster than seemed possible for someone carrying a full backpack. Marcus just smiled and said he was an early riser and liked to cover ground quickly in the morning, but his explanation did not make sense. She had been hiking steadily for 4 hours and had not seen any sign of him on the trail ahead of her. There were no alternate routes that would have allowed him to bypass her, and the terrain was too rugged for anyone to move that quickly off trail. That was when she started to realize that Marcus was not following the normal rules of trail hiking. Legitimate hikers stick to marked trails, camp in designated areas, and generally follow predictable patterns of movement. But Marcus seemed to be appearing and disappearing in ways that suggested he knew shortcuts, alternate routes, or was somehow tracking her movements in advance. She decided to test her theory by changing her planned route. Instead of continuing north, as she had originally intended, she told Marcus she was going to take a side trail to visit a waterfall that was about 2 miles off the main trail. He seemed very interested in this change of plans and asked detailed questions about which trail she was taking and how long she planned to stay. But instead of actually taking the side trail, she continued north on the main Appalachian Trail, moving as quickly as she could while still maintaining safety. She figured that if Marcus was just a normal hiker who had coincidentally been encountering her, he would take the side trail as planned, and she would not see him again. She was wrong. That evening, as she was preparing dinner at her campsite near Ashby Gap, Marcus emerged from the woods behind her. Not from the direction of the main trail, and not from the direction of the side trail she had claimed to be taking, but from the dense forest to the east, where there were no marked trails at all. "Did you enjoy the waterfall?" he asked with that same unsettling smile. She told him she had decided not to take the side trail after all, and he nodded as if this was completely normal. But she could see in his eyes that he knew she had been testing him, and that he had passed the test by somehow monitoring her actual movements rather than relying on what she had told him. That night, she barely slept. She could hear Marcus moving around his campsite frequently, and several times she saw his headlamp beams sweeping across the trees near her tent. Around 200 in the morning, she heard what sounded like him talking quietly to someone, but when she listened more carefully, she realized he was alone and seemed to be talking to himself. The fourth day, she made a decision that probably saved her life. Instead of continuing with her planned route, she hiked to the nearest road crossing and called for a ride to take her to the town of Front Royal. She told herself she was overreacting, that Marcus was probably just a socially awkward hiker who happened to be good at navigating off-trail, but every instinct she had was screaming that she needed to get away from him. As she waited for her ride at the road crossing, Marcus appeared one final time, emerging from the woods about 100 yards away. He stood there watching her for several minutes, making no attempt to approach or speak to her, just observing. When her ride arrived, he melted back into the trees and disappeared. She reported the incidents to the local ranger station in Front Royal, describing Marcus and his unusual behavior. The ranger who took her report seemed concerned and asked detailed questions about his appearance, his gear, and the specific locations where she had encountered him. 3 days later, the ranger called her with disturbing news. They had received similar reports from 2 other female hikers over the past month, both describing encounters with a man matching Marcus's description who had displayed the same pattern of behavior, appearing unexpectedly, asking personal questions, and somehow managing to track their movements in ways that seemed impossible for a normal hiker. Even more concerning, they had found evidence of surveillance activities in several areas along the trail. Hidden among rocks and vegetation near popular camping spots, they discovered small caches containing binoculars, trail cameras, notebooks with detailed observations of hikers, and maps marked with what appeared to be the daily movements of specific individuals. The ranger told her that Marcus, if that was even his real name, appeared to be using detailed knowledge of the trail system, including unofficial paths and old logging roads, to monitor and follow female hikers without being detected. His pattern was to make initial contact with potential targets, gather information about their plans, and then use his knowledge of alternate routes to track their movements while staying hidden. They never caught him. Despite setting up surveillance at locations where he had been spotted and coordinating with rangers throughout the region, Marcus seemed to have vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. The ranger speculated that he might have moved to a different section of trail or was lying low until attention died down. But here is what really haunts Chloe about the experience. How long had Marcus been watching her before he made that first contact? How much did he know about her plans, her background, her vulnerabilities? And what would have happened if she had not trusted her instincts and gotten off the trail when she did? The ranger told her that in his opinion, Marcus was almost certainly what law enforcement calls a preferential offender, someone who specifically targets victims in isolated settings where they have maximum control and minimum risk of intervention. The wilderness provides the perfect hunting ground for such predators because victims are isolated, help is far away, and the vastness of the terrain makes it easy to hide evidence of crimes. She still hikes, but she never hikes alone anymore, and she always informs multiple people of her exact plans and checks in regularly. Most importantly, she has learned to trust her instincts completely. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong, and no amount of politeness or social convention is worth risking your safety. The Appalachian Trail is generally a safe and welcoming place filled with kind and generous people who embody the best of the hiking community. But it's also a place where predators know they can find vulnerable targets far from help. Marcus taught her that the most dangerous animals in the wilderness sometimes walk on two legs and know exactly how to exploit our trust and goodwill. She sometimes wonders if he is still out there, still watching, still following, still perfecting his techniques for hunting human prey in the vast wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. And she wonders how many other women have encountered him since that day, and whether they all trusted their instincts enough to get away safely. Back in September 2022, a hiker organized what was supposed to be a memorable trip with 3 close friends along a section of the Appalachian Trail that runs through the coal country of Pennsylvania. They were all experienced hikers in their 30s, and this was meant to be their annual guys' trip, a chance to disconnect from work and family responsibilities and enjoy some wilderness camaraderie. When one of his friends expressed some concerns about the area they had chosen, saying something like, "I heard that section has some sketchy abandoned mining operations. Maybe we should pick a different route," the organizer dismissed his worries, telling him that the trail was well maintained and that thousands of people hike through there safely every year. He supposed his friend was right to be concerned. What they encountered in those mountains taught him that some dangers in the wilderness are deliberately created by people who know exactly how to exploit the helpful nature of hikers. Their group consisted of the organizer, his college roommate, his neighbor, and his brother-in-law. They started their hike on a Thursday morning in mid-September, planning to cover about 15 miles per day through some of the more remote sections of the trail in central Pennsylvania. The area they chose was known for its historical significance. This region had been heavily mined for coal from the 1800s through the mid-1900s, and there were numerous abandoned mining operations scattered throughout the mountains. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. The weather was perfect, the fall foliage was spectacular, and they were making good time while enjoying the kind of easy camaraderie that comes from years of friendship. They camped at designated sites, shared cooking duties, and spent their evenings around the campfire talking about everything from work stress to their kids' college plans. On the 3rd day, they were hiking through a particularly remote section when they heard something that stopped them in their tracks, human voices calling for help. The voices were coming from somewhere off the trail, deeper in the woods to their east. They were faint but clearly audible, and they sounded desperate. They could make out what appeared to be at least 2 different people, both calling out words like, "Help us" and "please" in voices that suggested they were in serious distress. The neighbor immediately wanted to investigate. "We have to help them," he said, already moving toward the sound. Someone could be seriously injured. But something about the situation felt wrong to the organizer from the beginning. The voices were coming from an area where, according to their maps, there were no marked trails or legitimate camping areas. The terrain in that direction was extremely rugged, with steep ravines and dense forest that would be difficult to navigate, even for experienced hikers. It seemed unlikely that anyone would be in that location unless they were seriously lost or had suffered some kind of accident. The college roommate shared his concerns. Maybe we should call for help instead of going in there ourselves, he suggested. If someone is injured badly enough to be calling for help like that, they probably need professional rescue, not four guys with basic first aid training. But the brother-in-law and the neighbor were already heading toward the voices, and the sound of people in distress was compelling. Against his better judgment, the organizer followed them, with his roommate reluctantly bringing up the rear. They left the main trail and began pushing through thick underbrush toward the source of the voices. The terrain was every bit as difficult as he had expected. They had to scramble over fallen logs, navigate around large boulders, and push through dense thickets that tore at their clothes and gear. The voices continued throughout their approach, always seeming to come from just a little farther ahead. After about 20 minutes of difficult hiking, they came to the edge of a steep ravine. At the bottom of the ravine, partially hidden by overhanging vegetation, was the entrance to what appeared to be an abandoned mine shaft. The voices were definitely coming from inside the mine. "Hello," the neighbor called down. "Are you hurt? How many of you are there?" The response was immediate and heartbreaking. "Please help us," came a voice from the darkness of the mine entrance. "We have been trapped in here for hours. There was a collapse." The brother-in-law was already looking for a way down into the ravine. "We have to get down there," he said. "They sound terrified," but the roommate grabbed his arm. "Wait," he said. "Something about this doesn't feel right. Why would anyone be exploring an abandoned mine? And look at this place. It doesn't look like there has been any recent activity here." He was right. The area around the mine entrance looked undisturbed, with no signs of recent human presence. There were no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no equipment or personal belongings that you would expect to find if people had been exploring the mine and gotten trapped. The organizer called down toward the mine entrance. "How did you get trapped in there? Are you injured? How many people are with you?" The response came back immediately, but as he listened more carefully, something struck him as odd. The voices sounded clear and distinct, as if they were coming from just inside the mine entrance rather than from deep within a collapsed tunnel. And the responses seemed almost too perfect. Exactly what you would expect trapped people to say, but without the kind of specific details that people in real distress would typically provide. "Let me try something," the roommate said quietly. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "What are your names?" "Where are you from?" There was a pause, longer than the previous responses had been. Then the voices resumed calling for help, but they did not answer his specific questions. They just repeated the same general pleas for assistance. That was when the organizer realized what they were dealing with. "Those are not live voices," he said. "That is a recording." The neighbor looked at him like he was crazy. "What are you talking about?" "Of course they're real. Listen to them." But now that he was paying closer attention, he could hear the subtle but telltale signs of recorded audio. The voices had a slightly artificial quality, and there was a faint background hiss that suggested they were being played through some kind of speaker system. Most damning of all, the same phrases were being repeated in a loop, the exact same words in the exact same order every few minutes. "This is a trap," he said. "Someone has set up a recording to lure people into that mine shaft." His brother-in-law was skeptical. Why would anyone do that? What would be the point? He did not have a good answer to that question, but every instinct he had was screaming that they needed to get away from this place immediately. Abandoned mines are incredibly dangerous, even under the best of circumstances. They can contain toxic gases, unstable structures, deep shafts, and hidden water. But a mine that was being used as some kind of trap was exponentially more dangerous. "We're leaving," he announced. "Right now. We're going back to the trail, and we are reporting this to the authorities." The neighbor was still reluctant to abandon what he believed were people in need of rescue, but the roommates supported the decision. "He's right," he said. "This whole situation feels wrong. If there really are people trapped in there, the professionals can handle it. But if it's some kind of trap, we don't want to find out what happens to people who fall for it." As they turned to leave, the organizer heard something that confirmed his worst fears. From somewhere in the woods behind them, not from the direction of the mine, came the sound of footsteps. Someone was moving through the forest, trying to stay hidden but not quite succeeding. The footsteps stopped whenever they stopped and resumed when they started moving again. They were being stalked. "Move fast," he whispered to the others. "Don't run, but don't waste any time getting back to the trail." The 20-minute hike back to the Appalachian Trail felt like the longest 20 minutes of his life. Behind them, the recorded voices continued their loop of pleas for help, while the unseen presence in the woods continued to shadow their movements. Several times he heard the snap of breaking twigs or the rustle of disturbed vegetation, always from a slightly different direction, suggesting that whoever was following them was trying to stay parallel to their route rather than directly behind them. When they finally reached the main trail, they immediately began hiking toward the nearest road, crossing as fast as they could safely move. None of them spoke about what they had experienced until they were several miles away from the mine site, but he could see in their faces that the others had also realized the danger they had narrowly avoided. At the first opportunity, they contacted the Pennsylvania State Police and reported what they had found. The trooper who took their initial report seemed skeptical, but he took down all the details and promised to investigate. 2 days later, he called back with information that made his blood run cold. A search team had located the mine shaft they had described, and they had found evidence that it was indeed being used as a trap for unsuspecting hikers. The recorded voices were being played through a battery-powered speaker system hidden near the mine entrance, designed to lure people into investigating. But more disturbing was what they found inside the mine itself. The shaft had been deliberately destabilized with strategically placed explosives. Anyone who entered the mine would have triggered a collapse that would have buried them alive with no hope of rescue. The entire setup was designed to kill people and make their deaths look like accidents. Near the mine site, they also found a campsite that had been occupied for an extended period. The campsite contained detailed maps of the local trail system, surveillance equipment, and notebooks filled with observations of hikers who had passed through the area. Most chilling were the tallies, marks indicating how many people had approached the mine in response to the recorded voices and how many had actually entered. According to the evidence they found, at least 3 groups of hikers had fallen for the trap over the previous month. None of those hikers had ever been reported missing, which suggested that the perpetrator was specifically targeting people who were hiking alone or in small groups without detailed itineraries that would trigger immediate search efforts if they failed to check in. They never caught the person responsible. Despite an extensive investigation and coordination with multiple law enforcement agencies, whoever had created this elaborate death trap seemed to have vanished as soon as they realized their scheme had been discovered. But here is what haunts the organizer most about the experience. How many other similar traps might be scattered throughout the vast wilderness of the Appalachian Trail system? How many missing hikers whose disappearances are attributed to getting lost or injured might actually have been victims of deliberate murder schemes designed to look like accidents? The investigator told him that this was not an isolated incident. Over the past decade, there had been several reports of similar schemes, recordings used to lure hikers into dangerous situations. Trail markers deliberately moved to lead people into hazardous areas, and campsites booby-trapped to cause injuries or deaths that would appear accidental. The wilderness attracts people who want to escape civilization, and unfortunately, that includes people who want to escape civilization specifically so they can prey upon others without interference from law enforcement. The vast size and remote nature of places like the Appalachian Trail make them perfect hunting grounds for human predators who understand that victims can disappear without a trace, and that evidence of crimes can be easily hidden or destroyed. They completed their hiking trip, but the experience fundamentally changed how they approach wilderness activities. They now carry satellite communication devices, file detailed itineraries with multiple people, and have developed protocols for dealing with situations that seem too convenient or too compelling to be legitimate. Most importantly, they have learned that the most dangerous predators in the wilderness are often the ones who understand human psychology well enough to exploit our natural instinct to help others in distress. The person who created that mine shaft trap knew exactly how to manipulate the compassion and heroism of good people, turning those virtues into weapons that could be used to destroy them. The organizer sometimes wonders if they were the intended targets that day or if they were just lucky enough to figure out the deception before it was too late. But he never wonders whether they made the right decision in walking away. Because sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is refuse to be a hero. A lone hiker was attempting her first solo section hike along the Appalachian Trail through the remote wilderness near the North Carolina and Tennessee border back in June 2021. At 28 years old, she considered herself an experienced day hiker, but she had never attempted a multi-day solo trip in such an isolated area. When her father expressed concerns about her hiking alone in that particular region, saying something like, "I heard there have been some strange reports from that area lately, and it gets pretty remote up there," she assured him that she was well prepared and that the trail was generally safe for solo female hikers. He was right to be worried. What she encountered during that storm taught her that sometimes the most dangerous situations arise from accepting help when you're most vulnerable and desperate. She started her hike on a Tuesday morning in mid-June, planning to cover about 10 miles per day through some of the most scenic and challenging sections of the trail. The weather forecast had been clear when she began, but by the second day, conditions had deteriorated rapidly. What started as light afternoon showers quickly developed into a serious thunderstorm system that brought heavy rain, dangerous lightning, and temperatures that dropped nearly 20 degrees from earlier in the day. By late afternoon on the second day, she was soaked through despite her rain gear, shivering uncontrollably and struggling to maintain her footing on the increasingly muddy and slippery trail. The storm was intensifying rather than moving through as she had hoped, and she was beginning to face a potentially dangerous situation. Hypothermia was a real concern, and setting up her tent in the middle of a lightning storm would have been extremely risky. That was when she saw the lights ahead of her through the trees. At first, she thought it might be another hiker with a particularly bright headlamp, but as she got closer, she realized the lights were stationary and much too bright to be coming from personal camping equipment. Through the rain and fog, she could make out what appeared to be a small building or facility of some kind, completely hidden from the main trail and not marked on any of her maps. The structure looked like it might be some kind of trail maintenance facility or emergency shelter. A single-story building with several windows glowing with warm light, and what appeared to be a covered area where equipment or vehicles might be stored. There were no signs or markers indicating what the facility was, but the presence of electric lights suggested it was some kind of official operation. As she approached the building, the door opened, and a man in what appeared to be some kind of uniform stepped out under the covered area. He was probably in his 40s, wearing dark clothing that looked official but not like any park service or trail maintenance uniform she was familiar with. He had a radio clipped to his belt and was carrying a powerful flashlight. "Hey there," he called out in a friendly voice. "You look like you could use some shelter from this storm. Why don't you come in and get dried off?" She was cold, wet, and genuinely concerned about her safety in the worsening storm. The offer of warm, dry shelter was incredibly appealing, and the man seemed professional and legitimate, but something about the situation felt slightly off. The building was not marked on any of her maps. There were no signs indicating what kind of facility it was, and she'd never heard of any trail maintenance or emergency shelters in this particular area. "What kind of facility is this?" she asked, trying to sound casual while keeping her distance. "Trail maintenance station," he replied without hesitation. "We monitor this section of trail, handle emergency situations, coordinate with search and rescue. You picked a good night to stumble across us. This storm is supposed to get worse before it gets better." His explanation sounded reasonable, and the building certainly looked like it could be some kind of official facility. There were what appeared to be communication antennas on the roof, several vehicles parked under the covered area, and through the windows she could see what looked like office equipment and maps on the walls. "I'm Ashley," she said, finally approaching closer to the building. "I am section hiking through here and got caught in this weather." "Nice to meet you, Ashley," he said with a warm smile. "I'm Frank. Come on inside and we'll get you warmed up. We have coffee, dry clothes, and you can wait out the storm in comfort." Frank led her into the building, which was indeed warm and dry. The interior looked professional. There were desks with computers, filing cabinets, maps covering the walls, and what appeared to be communication equipment. Two other men were inside, both wearing similar dark uniforms, and they introduced themselves as Steve and Mike. They all seemed friendly and professional, asking about her hiking plans and expressing concern about her safety in the storm. They provided her with a hot cup of coffee and a towel to dry off, and suggested she could stay in their break room until the weather improved. The break room contained several cots, apparently for staff who worked overnight shifts, along with basic amenities like a small kitchen and bathroom facilities. For the first hour or so, everything seemed perfectly normal. The three men continued with what appeared to be routine work, checking equipment, monitoring radio communications, and updating logs and paperwork. They periodically checked on her to make sure she was comfortable and offered food from their well-stocked kitchen. But as the evening progressed, she began to notice things that made her increasingly uncomfortable. First, none of the radio communications she overheard sounded like legitimate trail maintenance or emergency response traffic. The conversations were brief and cryptic, using terminology she did not recognize and discussing activities that seemed unrelated to trail management. Second, despite their claims to be monitoring the trail for safety purposes, they seemed remarkably uninterested in her specific hiking plans, or in coordinating with any outside agencies about her presence in the area. Legitimate trail maintenance personnel would typically want detailed information about where she had come from, where she was planning to go, and whether anyone was expecting her to check in. Most concerning, she noticed that all the maps on the walls had markings that did not correspond to official trail information. There were symbols and notations that looked like they might indicate surveillance positions, patrol routes, or other activities that had nothing to do with trail maintenance. Around 1000, Frank informed her that they were switching to their night shift operation and that she should stay in the break room for her own safety. He explained that they conducted different types of work at night that could be dangerous for civilians to observe. "What kind of work?" she asked, trying to sound casually curious rather than suspicious. Security patrols, equipment testing, coordination with other agencies, he replied vaguely. Nothing for you to worry about, but we need to ask that you stay inside until morning. That was when she realized she was not in a trail maintenance facility at all. Whatever these people were doing, it was not legitimate trail management, and her presence had created a situation they needed to control. The friendly offers of help had been designed to get her inside the building, and now she was effectively being held against her will. She told them she was feeling much better and that she wanted to continue hiking, storm or no storm. But Frank made it clear that leaving was not an option. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that," he said, his tone still friendly but with an underlying firmness that made his meaning clear. "The storm is still dangerous, and our night operations create additional safety hazards. You will be much safer staying here until morning." Steve and Mike had stopped their work activities and were now focused entirely on her. She could see that all three men were armed with what appeared to be firearms in holsters, though they had not made any threatening gestures. She spent the next several hours pretending to sleep on one of the cots while actually trying to figure out how to escape. The building had several exits, but she could see through the windows that at least one person was always positioned outside, apparently on guard duty. The storm was still raging, which would make any escape attempt extremely dangerous, even if she could get out of the building undetected. Around 3:00 in the morning, she overheard a conversation between Frank and someone on the radio that made her blood run cold. They were discussing the hiker situation and coordination with what sounded like other similar facilities in the region. The conversation included references to processing people who had seen too much and coordinating with disposal teams. She realized that whatever operation these people were running, they had protocols for dealing with civilians who accidentally discovered their activities. And those protocols apparently involved making sure those civilians never had a chance to report what they had seen. She knew she had to get out of there immediately, regardless of the storm conditions. Around 4:00 in the morning, she noticed that the guard outside had moved to a position where he could not see one of the rear exits. She quietly gathered her gear, slipped out of the break room, and made her way to the back door. The storm was still intense, but not as severe as it had been earlier in the evening. She managed to get out of the building and into the woods without being detected, then began working her way back toward the main trail using her compass and GPS. The next few hours were some of the most terrifying of her life. She could hear vehicles moving through the area, and several times she saw flashlight beams sweeping through the woods as the men searched for her. She had to move slowly and carefully to avoid making noise or being detected, all while navigating through rough terrain in darkness and continuing rain. Just after dawn, she reached a section of the main trail where she encountered two legitimate hikers heading southbound. They were able to confirm her location and help her navigate to the nearest road crossing, where she immediately contacted local authorities. The sheriff's department took her report seriously and organized an immediate investigation of the area where she had found the facility. But when they arrived at the location, the building was completely gone. There was no trace that any structure had ever existed there. No foundation, no cleared area, no equipment, nothing. The investigator told her that they had been aware of reports of suspicious activities in that region, but had never been able to locate any evidence of illegal operations. Her description of a mobile or temporary facility that could be quickly dismantled and removed fit with their theories about how such operations might avoid detection. 6 months later, she was contacted by a federal agent who told her that her report had been part of a larger investigation into illegal activities in remote wilderness areas. He could not provide details about the nature of the investigation, but he confirmed that there were organized criminal operations using the isolation of places like the Appalachian Trail to conduct activities that required complete secrecy from law enforcement and the general public. She never found out exactly what those people were doing in that facility, but the agent strongly suggested that her escape had probably saved her life. He told her that people who accidentally discovered such operations were considered security threats that needed to be neutralized to protect the larger criminal enterprise. She still hikes, but never alone and never without detailed check-in protocols with multiple people who know exactly where she is supposed to be and when. Most importantly, she has learned that accepting help from strangers in the wilderness requires the same caution and skepticism that you would use in any other situation where you might be vulnerable to predators. The wilderness attracts people who want to escape the oversight and regulations of civilized society. And unfortunately, that includes people who want to escape those constraints specifically so they can engage in criminal activities without interference. The vast size and remoteness of places like the Appalachian Trail make them perfect locations for operations that require complete secrecy and isolation from law enforcement. She sometimes still wakes up wondering what would have happened if she had not overheard that radio conversation or if she had not been able to escape undetected. But she never wonders whether she was overreacting or being paranoid. Because sometimes the most dangerous predators in the wilderness are the ones who understand exactly how to exploit our trust and our desperation for help when we are most vulnerable. Back in August 2019, a man thought he had learned everything there was to know about reading sign and tracking in the wilderness. Let's call him the tracker. He had been hunting and tracking for over 25 years, had completed wilderness survival courses with former military instructors, and considered himself an expert at interpreting animal behavior and human movement patterns in the backcountry. When a fellow tracking enthusiast suggested they explore some remote sections of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia to practice their skills, he jumped at the opportunity. A friend had mentioned something like, "That area has some really isolated stretches where you might not see another person for days. Are you sure that is safe for just the two of you?" The tracker told him that his partner and he were both experienced woodsmen who could handle themselves in any wilderness situation. He supposed his friend was right to be concerned. What he discovered on that trail taught him that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who understands exactly how to use your own expertise against you. His tracking partner was a retired Forest Service ranger who had decades of experience in wilderness law enforcement. They planned to spend 5 days hiking through some of the more remote sections of the Virginia mountains, using the opportunity to practice advanced tracking techniques and document wildlife patterns in an area known for its diverse ecosystem. They started their expedition on a Monday morning in mid-August, hiking north from a remote trailhead that saw very little traffic. Their plan was to move slowly, spending time at each campsite, analyzing tracks, scat, feeding signs, and other evidence of animal activity. For the first 2 days, everything went exactly as planned. They found excellent examples of bear sign, documented several deer trails, and located what appeared to be a bobcat den site. But on the 3rd day, the tracker began to notice something that made his professional instincts alert. Mixed in with the normal pattern of animal tracks, he was finding human footprints that did not make sense. The first anomaly he noticed was a set of bootprints that appeared to be systematically following the route that he and his partner had taken the previous day. The prints were relatively fresh, probably made within 6 to 8 hours of their passage, and they showed a deliberate pattern of movement that suggested someone had been tracking their progress rather than simply hiking the same trail. The second anomaly was more concerning. The boot prints showed that whoever was following them had left the main trail at several points to observe their campsites from concealed positions. He found clear evidence of someone lying prone behind fallen logs and rock formations, with crushed vegetation and scuff marks indicating extended observation periods. "Partner," he said, calling the ranger over to examine the sign he had found, "take a look at this and tell me what you think." His partner was an even more experienced tracker than he was, and his analysis confirmed the worst fears. "Someone has been watching us," the ranger said grimly. "These positions were carefully chosen to provide a visual surveillance of our camps while remaining hidden. Whoever did this knows what they are doing." They began to backtrack along their route, looking for additional evidence of surveillance. What they found was deeply disturbing. The person following them had been documenting their movements for at least 2 days, establishing multiple observation posts and apparently photographing or otherwise recording their activities. More concerning was the systematic nature of the surveillance. This was not the work of a curious hiker or someone who had simply stumbled across their trail. The observation posts were positioned with military precision. The movement patterns showed advanced fieldcraft skills, and the overall behavior suggested someone with professional training in surveillance and tracking. "This feels like a hunting pattern," the ranger said, echoing the tracker's own thoughts. "Someone is treating us like prey animals, learning our habits and behavior patterns." That afternoon, they made a discovery that confirmed their suspicions and escalated the situation to a completely different level of danger. Hidden in a natural rock formation about 200 yards from one of our campsites, they found what appeared to be a semi-permanent surveillance position. The hide was expertly constructed using natural materials and military camouflage techniques. Inside, they found evidence of extended occupation, food wrappers, water bottles, and what appeared to be human waste that had been carefully buried according to military field sanitation protocols. But most disturbing was the equipment they found: high-end binoculars, a spotting scope, cameras with telephoto lenses, notebooks containing detailed observations, and maps of the local trail system with markings that indicated multiple surveillance positions and movement routes. The notebooks contained entries that made the tracker's blood run cold, detailed descriptions of hikers who had passed through the area, including physical descriptions, gear inventories, behavioral observations, and what appeared to be threat assessments. One entry, dated just 2 weeks earlier, described a family with 2 teenage children and included notes about their physical fitness levels, equipment quality, and potential usefulness. Another entry described a solo female hiker in clinical detail, noting her daily routine, camping preferences, and what the observer termed vulnerability windows, times when she was isolated and exposed. "Jesus Christ," the ranger whispered as he read through the notebooks. "This guy is hunting people." They were looking at evidence of what appeared to be a systematic operation to identify, track, and potentially abduct hikers in this remote area. The level of organization and professionalism suggested military or law enforcement training, and the scope of the operation indicated it had been going on for months or possibly years. The tracker photographed everything they found while his partner used his satellite communicator to contact law enforcement. But as they were documenting the evidence, he heard something that made every survival instinct he had scream a warning: the sound of someone approaching through the woods with the same stealthy movement pattern they had been tracking. "We need to go," he whispered to his partner. "Right now." They quickly gathered their gear and began moving toward the main trail as quietly as possible. But whoever was approaching was good, very good, and was systematically cutting off their escape routes. Every time they tried to move in a particular direction, they would find fresh sign indicating someone had recently moved through that area, forcing them to change course. It became clear that they were being herded toward a specific location, probably where their pursuer had prepared some kind of trap or ambush site. The person tracking them was using advanced tactical movement techniques, coordinating multiple positions, and demonstrating a level of fieldcraft that suggested military special operations or elite law enforcement training. For the next 4 hours, the tracker and the ranger used every tracking and evasion technique they knew to avoid being cornered by their pursuer. They moved through the roughest terrain they could find, used water to mask their scent trail, employed counter-surveillance techniques, and constantly changed their movement patterns to avoid becoming predictable. The chase became a deadly game of cat and mouse between their collective decades of wilderness experience and someone who was clearly a professional human predator. Several times they found evidence that their pursuer had anticipated their movements and positioned himself to intercept them, forcing them to abort planned routes and find alternative paths. Around sunset, they managed to reach a road crossing where the ranger's satellite communicator finally got a clear signal to emergency services. Within an hour, they had Virginia State Police, FBI agents, and what appeared to be federal tactical units converging on the area. The multi-agency response team conducted an extensive search of the area over the next 3 days. They found additional surveillance sites, more equipment caches, and evidence of what appeared to be a sophisticated operation that had been targeting hikers throughout the region. Most disturbing was what they found at a location about 5 miles from where they had been pursued. Hidden in a deep ravine was a facility that appeared to be designed for holding people against their will. The facility contained restraints, basic life support equipment, and what forensic investigators described as processing materials that suggested victims had been held there for extended periods. They also found personal belongings from at least 6 different hikers, identification documents, credit cards, jewelry, and other items that had apparently been taken from people who had been abducted in the area. DNA evidence linked some of these items to missing persons cases from across the Mid-Atlantic region, but they never found their pursuer. Despite the extensive search operation and coordination with multiple law enforcement agencies, whoever had been hunting them seemed to have vanished completely. The investigators told them that the level of operational security and tactical expertise demonstrated suggested someone with extensive military or intelligence training who understood how to evade even professional manhunts. 6 months later, the tracker was contacted by an FBI agent who told him that the investigation had revealed connections to similar operations in other remote wilderness areas along the eastern seaboard. The agent said that what they had discovered appeared to be part of a larger network of individuals or groups who were using the isolation and limited law enforcement presence in wilderness areas to hunt human prey. The agent explained that people like their pursuer were attracted to places like the Appalachian Trail because they provided access to vulnerable targets in locations where crimes could be committed without witnesses, and where evidence could be easily hidden or destroyed. The vast size and remote nature of the wilderness made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to maintain effective surveillance or response capabilities. What haunts the tracker most about the experience is the realization that this person had been operating in that area for an extended period, successfully abducting and presumably killing hikers without being detected. The sophistication of the operation and the evidence of multiple victims suggested that they had stumbled across something much larger and more dangerous than a single disturbed individual. The investigator told him that based on the evidence they found, they estimated that the operation had been responsible for the disappearance of at least a dozen hikers over the past 2 years. Most of these disappearances had been attributed to people getting lost, suffering accidents, or simply deciding to abandon their hikes without informing anyone. The tracker and his partner still track and hunt, but they never go into remote wilderness areas without extensive communication equipment and detailed check-in protocols with law enforcement. They also carry more than just hunting knives when they are in areas where human predators might be operating. Most importantly, they have learned to recognize that their tracking skills, which made them effective hunters of animals, also made them attractive targets for someone who hunted humans. Their expertise and confidence in the wilderness had made them overconfident about their ability to handle human threats, nearly getting them killed in the process. The wilderness attracts people who want to test themselves against nature, but it also attracts people who want to test themselves against other humans in an environment where they have maximum advantage and minimum risk of consequences. Understanding that distinction has probably saved their lives more than once since that encounter. The tracker sometimes wonders how many other professional human hunters are operating in remote wilderness areas, using their knowledge of human psychology and behavior to select and stalk victims who think they are safely isolated from the predators of civilized society. But he never wonders whether they were overreacting or being paranoid that day. Because sometimes the most dangerous animal in the forest is the one that has learned to hunt the hunters. Back in September 2020, a man was just 5 days away from completing his lifelong dream of through hiking the entire Appalachian Trail. At 52 years old, the through hiker had spent 6 months walking from Georgia to Maine, covering over 2,000 miles of some of the most challenging terrain in the eastern United States. As he approached the final stretch toward Mount Katahdin, he was exhausted but euphoric, already planning his summit celebration and thinking about how he would describe this achievement to friends and family back home. When a fellow hiker he met near Monson had mentioned something like, "Be careful those last few days. I heard there have been some weird incidents with people targeting successful through hikers near the end of their journey." He brushed off the concerns, telling him he had made it this far safely, and that he was too close to the finish to worry about unlikely dangers. He supposed now that the man was right to be concerned. What he encountered in those final days taught him that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who specifically target people when they are most vulnerable and have the most to lose. He had been documenting his through-hike journey on a popular hiking blog, posting regular updates about his progress, challenges, and experiences along the trail. The blog had developed a modest following of fellow hikers and outdoor enthusiasts who were living vicariously through his adventure. He shared details about his daily mileage, camping locations, weather conditions, and the various people he met along the way. It was a way to stay connected with the outside world and to inspire others who might be considering their own long-distance hiking adventures. As he entered the final section of the trail in Maine, he was making excellent time and feeling stronger than he had in months. Despite the physical toll of the long journey, his blog followers were excitedly tracking his progress toward Mount Katahdin, and he was receiving dozens of encouraging messages from people who had been following his story from the beginning. On his second to last day, as he was hiking through the remote wilderness south of Baxter State Park, he encountered what appeared to be a trail angel, one of the wonderful volunteers who provide support and encouragement to through hikers along their journey. Trail angels are a cherished part of the hiking community, offering everything from rides to town to hot meals to simple words of encouragement when hikers need it most. This particular trail angel introduced himself as Mark and said he had been following the blog and wanted to congratulate him on nearly completing such an incredible achievement. He was probably in his early 40s, well-dressed in expensive outdoor gear and driving a late-model SUV that looked capable of handling the rough back roads in the area. "Samuel Brooks, right," the man said with a warm smile as the hiker approached his vehicle. "I have been reading your blog religiously for the past few months. What an incredible journey you have documented. You should be incredibly proud of yourself." The through hiker was surprised and flattered that someone had driven all the way out to this remote location specifically to meet him. The man seemed genuinely enthusiastic about his accomplishment and asked detailed questions about some of the more challenging sections described in the blog posts. He had clearly been paying close attention to the journey and could reference specific stories and experiences that had been shared. "I know you are probably eager to finish strong," the man said, "but I was wondering if you would be interested in a little celebration before your final push to Katahdin. I have rented a cabin about 20 minutes from here, and I would love to provide you with a real meal, a hot shower, and a comfortable bed for your last night on the trail. Consider it my way of honoring what you have accomplished." The offer was incredibly generous and appealing. After 6 months of sleeping on the ground and eating trail food, the prospect of a hot shower and a real bed was almost irresistible. The man seemed like a genuine trail angel who wanted to provide a memorable conclusion to his journey. But something about the situation felt slightly off, though he could not quite put his finger on what was bothering him. The man knew too many details about his specific experiences and seemed to have memorized substantial portions of the blog posts. His questions were more probing than what you would expect from a casual follower, and he seemed particularly interested in the exact timeline for reaching Mount Katahdin. "That is incredibly generous," the hiker said carefully, "but I have already made arrangements for tonight. I am planning to camp at Rainbow Lake and then make my final push to Katahdin first thing in the morning." The supposed trail angel seemed disappointed, but not surprised by the response. "I understand completely," he said. "The final stretch is sacred and you want to experience it on your own terms, but please, at least let me give you some supplies for your last night. I brought some special trail food, fresh water, and a few other things that might make your final evening more comfortable." He opened the back of his SUV and began pulling out what appeared to be high-quality trail supplies: freeze-dried meals, energy bars, electrolyte drinks, and other items that would indeed be welcome after months of rationing and resupplying. Everything looked legitimate and expensive, the kind of gear that serious hikers use for extended wilderness trips. As the man was organizing the supplies, the hiker noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the back of the SUV, partially hidden under a tarp, he could see what appeared to be restraints, zip ties, rope, and what looked like a small cage or kennel that would be sized for a human being rather than an animal. He tried to keep his expression neutral while processing what he was seeing. The man continued talking about the blog and the journey, but now his questions seemed more like an interrogation than admiration. He wanted to know exactly when the hiker planned to summit Katahdin, whether anyone was meeting him there, what his plans were after completing the trail, and whether he had family or friends who were tracking his progress closely. "You know," the the man said, still organizing supplies but watching his face carefully. "I've been following several through hikers this year, and yours is by far the most impressive journey. You have really documented everything beautifully. Your followers feel like they know you personally." That was when the through hiker realized the true nature of the situation. This was not a random trail angel who had stumbled across his blog. He was someone who specifically targeted successful through hikers, using their own documentation and social media presence to learn their habits, preferences, and vulnerabilities. He had been studying him for months, learning everything he could about his journey, his personality, and his patterns. The supplies he was offering were not generous gifts. They were bait, designed to get him to lower his guard or accompany him to a remote location where he could be overpowered without interference. The restraints in the vehicle suggested that the plan involved taking him alive, probably for reasons he did not want to contemplate. "Actually," he said, backing away from the vehicle while trying to sound casual, "I just remembered that I promised to check in with my wife at a specific time today, and I am running behind schedule. I need to get moving so I can reach a spot with cell coverage." The man's demeanor changed immediately. The friendly smile disappeared, and his eyes became cold and calculating. "That is unfortunate," he said, no longer pretending to be a benevolent trail angel. "I was really hoping we could spend some time together discussing your experiences in more detail." The hiker began walking backward toward the trail while keeping his eyes on the man. "Maybe we can connect after I finish," he said, still trying to maintain the pretense of a normal conversation while creating distance between them. But the man was no longer playing along with the charade. He reached into his vehicle and pulled out what appeared to be a telescoping baton, the kind used by law enforcement for crowd control. "Samuel," he said, his voice now completely different, cold, professional, threatening. "I think you misunderstood the nature of this conversation. This is not actually optional." That was when he ran. He crashed through the woods toward the main trail as fast as he could move with a full pack, while behind him he could hear the man pursuing on foot. The man was clearly in excellent physical condition and was gaining on him despite his 6-month head start in trail fitness. But the hiker had two advantages. He knew the terrain from studying his maps, and he was desperate enough to take risks that a rational person would avoid. He reached the main trail and began running north as fast as he could sustain, hoping to reach Rainbow Lake, where there might be other hikers or some kind of shelter. Behind him, he could hear the man crashing through the underbrush, and several times he caught glimpses of him through the trees as he tried to parallel his route. After about 2 miles of the most intense running of his life, he reached a section of trail where he knew there was a steep drop off to one side and a cliff face on the other. It was a narrow passage that would force the man to approach him from behind rather than trying to flank or surround him. He stopped running and turned to face him, pulling out his hiking knife and his emergency whistle. When the man emerged from the woods, he was no longer trying to maintain any pretense of being a friendly trail angel. He was carrying the baton in one hand and what appeared to be a taser in the other, and his expression was that of a predator who had been momentarily thwarted but was confident of ultimate success. "This is going to be much more difficult than it needed to be," he said, breathing hard from the chase. "I had planned to make this comfortable for you, but now we are going to have to do things the hard way." The hiker activated his emergency beacon and began blowing his whistle as loudly as possible while keeping his knife ready. The narrow passage meant that the man could not easily rush him without exposing himself to the knife, but it also meant that he had no escape route if he managed to get past his defenses. For several minutes, they faced each other in what felt like a standoff from an old Western movie. The man tried several times to close the distance, but each time the hiker was able to force him back with the knife while continuing to sound the emergency whistle. He could see his frustration growing as he realized that his carefully planned abduction was turning into a prolonged confrontation that increased the risk of discovery. Finally, they heard what they were both listening for, the sound of voices approaching from the north. Other hikers had heard his whistle and were coming to investigate. The man immediately turned and disappeared back into the woods, moving with the same speed and stealth that had allowed him to pursue him earlier. The approaching hikers turned out to be a group of day hikers who had been exploring the area and were familiar with emergency protocols. They helped him contact local authorities using their satellite communicator and stayed with him until law enforcement arrived. The investigation that followed revealed that the man, whose real name turned out to be Marcus Fletcher, had been targeting successful through hikers for over 2 years. He used social media, hiking blogs, and trail forums to identify potential victims, learning their routes, preferences, and personal information before approaching them as a supposed trail angel. Investigators found that Fletcher had successfully abducted at least 3 other through hikers over the past 2 years, all of whom had disappeared without a trace near the end of their journeys. Their families had assumed they had suffered accidents or gotten lost, never suspecting that they had been deliberately targeted by someone who understood exactly how to exploit the trust and vulnerability of exhausted hikers who were so close to achieving their dreams. The cabin that Fletcher had mentioned was real, and when authorities searched it, they found evidence of the other victims along with what appeared to be a sophisticated operation for holding people against their will for extended periods. The investigation suggested that Fletcher was selling his victims to individuals or organizations that were willing to pay substantial amounts for people who would not be missed or searched for immediately. Fletcher was never captured. Despite an extensive manhunt involving multiple law enforcement agencies, he seemed to vanish as completely as his victims had. The investigator told the hiker that people like Fletcher often have multiple identities, extensive resources, and detailed escape plans that allow them to disappear when their operations are compromised. He completed his through hike the next day, summiting Mount Katahdin with a Maine State Police escort to ensure his safety. But the achievement felt hollow after learning about the other hikers who had not been as fortunate as he was. The celebration he had planned was replaced by memorial services for people whose dreams had been cut short just miles from their goal. 6 months later, he was contacted by an FBI agent who told him that Fletcher appeared to be part of a larger network of individuals who specialized in targeting specific types of victims in remote locations. The agent explained that successful through hikers were particularly attractive targets because they were physically fit, mentally resilient, and had developed the survival skills that would make them valuable to certain types of buyers. The most disturbing part of the investigation was learning that Fletcher had been following his blog for the entire 6 months of his hike, studying his personality, his decision-making patterns, and his physical capabilities. He had been planning the abduction since the hiker was still in Georgia, patiently waiting for the perfect opportunity when he would be most vulnerable and most isolated. The man still hikes, but he no longer maintains public blogs or social media accounts that could be used to track his movements or activities. Most importantly, he has learned that sharing our adventures and achievements online can make us targets for predators who understand exactly how to use our own enthusiasm and pride against us. The wilderness attracts people who want to test themselves against nature and achieve extraordinary goals, but it also attracts people who want to exploit and destroy those achievements for their own profit. Understanding that distinction has probably saved his life more than once since that encounter near Mount Katahdin. He sometimes wonders how many other hikers have encountered Fletcher or people like him, and whether they all trusted their instincts enough to escape safely. But he never wonders whether he was overreacting or being paranoid that day. Because sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who understand exactly how to hunt people who have spent months preparing for every danger, except the ones that walk on two legs.